My name's Corporal Nate Ridley. Well, former corporal now. I'm 29, and I want to start with the photo because that's really where this whole thing actually begins for me. It was a picture of a for sale sign planted in the front yard of the house I grew up in, sent to me by my old neighbor, a woman named Glenda, with one line underneath it. Nate, is this real? Did your parents tell you about this? I was sitting in a tent in Kandahar province when that text came through, 10 months into a 12-month deployment. No, nobody had told me anything. Let me back up though, because you need the whole picture first, or none of this makes sense. I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, in a house my grandfather built back in the 50s. Small place, nothing fancy, but it had been in my family for 3 generations. My dad, Wallace Ridley, inherited it from his own father. My mom, Carol, raised me and my younger sister, Dana, in that house. I have actual memories of learning to ride a bike in that driveway, of my grandfather sitting on that same porch telling stories before he passed when I was 12. When my grandfather died, he left the house jointly to my dad and to me. That's not typical, I know. Most grandparents just leave things to their own kids. But my grandfather and I were close. Closer, honestly, than he ever was with my dad. And in his will, he split ownership of that house 50-50 between the two of us. My dad got to live there, obviously, since I was only 17 at the time and still in high school. But legally, on paper, half that house was mine. And had been mine since I was 17 years old. Nobody made a big deal of it growing up. My dad managed the property, paid the taxes, handled repairs. I never asked for money from it, never really thought about it much beyond knowing, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I technically owned half of my childhood home. I joined the Army at 22, right after a rough stretch where I couldn't quite figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Turned out I was good at it. Good enough that I made it into an infantry unit I was proud of, deployed twice before this last one. The one that put me in Kandahar for what was supposed to be 12 months. My family situation, I should tell you, wasn't perfect even before any of this happened. My dad and I had a complicated relationship, honestly. He wasn't cruel, not exactly, just distant. Never quite approved of me joining the military, thought I was throwing away opportunities, though he never specified what those opportunities actually were. My mom was warmer, but she mostly went along with whatever my dad decided, the way she always had. My sister Dana, 4 years younger than me, had a harder time as an adult than I did. Some substance issues in her early 20s, a couple stints in and out of stability, the kind of thing my parents worried about constantly, and, I think, quietly resented me for not needing them to worry about in the same way. I didn't think much about any of that while I was deployed, honestly. You don't have room to think about family drama when you're focused on staying alive and keeping your guys alive. I called home when I could, maybe once every couple weeks, mostly short conversations, nothing that ever hinted at anything being wrong. Then, 10 months into deployment, that text came through from Glenda. I stared at that photo for a long time before I responded. A for sale sign, planted right there in the yard I grew up in, red and white, the local realtor's name printed across it like it was just any other listing. I called my mom that same day, using whatever spotty connection we had access to at the time. She picked up sounding surprised to hear from me outside our usual schedule. "Mom," I said, "Glenda sent me a photo of a for sale sign in our yard. What's going on?" There was a pause, a long one. Then she said, "Your father's been meaning to call you about that." "Meaning to call me?" I said. "The sign's already up," she explained, slowly, carefully, in a way that told me she was choosing her words with a lot of care, that Dana had gotten into some trouble, real trouble this time, not the usual kind. She owed money to some people, apparently connected to a relapse a few months earlier, money that had escalated into something serious enough that my parents felt they had no choice but to sell the house to cover it. "How much?" I asked. "Around $90,000, she said. I sat there in that tent, phone against my ear, feeling something cold spread through my chest. "That's half the house, Mom. My half. You can't just sell it without me." Another pause. Then, quieter. "Your father's already found a buyer. It's actually already under contract, Nate. I'm sorry." We didn't know how else to help her. I want you to understand something about that moment. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. Not in the way I'd become angry later. My first feeling was actually concern for Dana, genuine fear about what kind of trouble required $90,000 to fix. That's just how I'm built, I guess. Worry first, anger later. But as the days passed, and I got more details, piece by piece, through increasingly tense phone calls, the anger did come. Because it turned out my dad hadn't just made a unilateral decision about property that was half mine. He'd forged my signature on the listing agreement. I found that out almost by accident, actually. I asked my mom to send me copies of the paperwork, just so I could understand exactly what was happening from 10,000 miles away. She hesitated, said she'd have to ask my dad first, which itself told me something. When the documents finally came through, about a week later, there it was, my signature, on a real estate listing agreement, dated a date I could prove, easily. I was not anywhere near a computer or a notary, because I had deployment records showing exactly where I was and what I was doing that day. I called Devin Ashcroft. Actually, no, wait. Let me think about this differently. I called a military legal assistance office, actually, the JAG office attached to my base, because I remembered hearing other guys mention they handled family legal issues sometimes, even things happening back home while deployed. I explained the whole situation to a JAG officer named Captain Renner, a sharp woman who listened carefully and then told me something that made the whole situation feel a lot more serious than I'd initially understood. If your father forged your signature on a legal document related to jointly owned property, she said, that's not just a family dispute. That's document fraud, potentially, and depending on your state's laws, it could be prosecutable. Beyond that, since the property's jointly owned, any sale without your legitimate consent could be challenged and potentially voided. I sat with that for a long moment. My own father, forging my signature. To sell the house, my grandfather left half to me, specifically, because he trusted me with it. Here's the thing, though. I still cared about my sister. I still wanted to understand what kind of trouble she was actually in, because $90,000 is a specific, serious number, not just casual debt. I called Dana directly, something I probably should have done from the start, instead of just processing everything secondhand through my parents. She was hesitant at first, clearly having been told, I think, to let our parents handle explaining things to me, but eventually she told me the truth, more of it than my parents had. The debt wasn't from a relapse exactly, not directly anyway. She'd gotten involved, about 8 months earlier, with a guy who turned out to be running some kind of small-scale operation, and Dana had gotten pulled into holding money and product for him without fully understanding, at first, what she was actually involved in. When things went bad, when this guy got arrested and some of his associates came looking for money that had gone missing during the whole mess, Dana ended up on the hook for a debt that was never really fully hers in the first place, but that nobody involved particularly cared about the fairness of. I didn't ask them to sell the house, Dana said, her voice shaking over the phone. I told them I'd figure something else out. Dad just decided this was the fastest way to make the whole thing disappear. That detail mattered to me, actually, hearing it directly from her. This wasn't Dana orchestrating some scheme to get money out of me. This was my dad, panicked, making a decision about property that was half mine, using my forged signature, without even fully consulting the person the money was supposedly protecting. I worked with Captain Renner over the following 2 weeks to put together a formal legal challenge, using the JAG office's connections to a civilian attorney back in Texas who specialized in real estate fraud, a guy named Marcus Delgado. Marcus reviewed the forged documents, compared them against verified samples of my actual signature from military paperwork, and confirmed what I already suspected. It wasn't even a particularly good forgery. My dad had clearly rushed it, probably assuming nobody would ever scrutinize it closely enough to notice, especially not while I was thousands of miles away, focused on staying alive. Marcus filed an emergency injunction to halt the sale, citing the fraudulent signature and my legitimate half-ownership of the property. It worked, but just barely. The sale had been scheduled to close in 11 days when the injunction went through, stopping everything just before the paperwork would have finalized. I called my dad directly after that, the first time we'd spoken one-on-one in months. "You forged my signature," I said. No preamble, nothing soft about how I opened it. On a legal document. To sell my grandfather's house without telling me the truth. He didn't deny it immediately, which honestly surprised me a little. There was a long silence first. Then, "I didn't think you'd say no, Nate. I thought I was doing what needed to be done, and I didn't have time to wait for you to fly home and sign things properly." "You didn't ask," I said. "That's the whole point. You didn't ask. You just decided, and then you committed fraud to make it happen faster." "Your sister could have gone to jail," he said, his voice rising now, defensive in a way I recognized from years of watching him deflect responsibility onto whatever crisis was most immediate. "Or worse. I did what I had to do to protect this family. I'm part of this family too," I said. "And you protected it by defrauding me while I was deployed in a combat zone. Does that seem fair to you, actually, when you say it out loud like that?" He didn't have a good answer. I don't think he'd ever actually said it out loud to himself before that moment. Not in those specific terms. Here's where the story gets complicated in a way I didn't expect, though, because it wasn't as simple as just stopping a fraudulent sale and being done with it. Dana's debt was still real, still owed, still attached to genuinely dangerous people who weren't going to just disappear because a real estate transaction got legally blocked. I sat with that for a long time, still deployed, still limited in what I could actually do from that distance. I talked to Captain Renner again, and she helped me understand my actual options more clearly. The house being jointly owned meant my dad couldn't sell it without my consent, full stop, forgery aside. But it also meant I had leverage now, real leverage, in deciding how this situation actually got resolved, rather than just having decisions made around me and forged onto paper while I wasn't there to object. I made a decision that I know surprised my dad, and honestly surprised me a little too, thinking back on it. I told him I'd agree to sell the house, legitimately this time, with my actual consent and signature, but only under specific conditions. First, the money from the sale would be split according to actual ownership, my half going directly into an account controlled by me, not by him. Second, whatever portion went toward Dana's debt would come specifically from my dad's half, not automatically assumed to come proportionally from mine just because it was convenient. And third, and this mattered most to me honestly, I wanted Dana to actually get help. Real help, not just a payoff that made a scary situation disappear without addressing whatever led her into that situation in the first place. I offered to use part of my own share of the sale to fund a proper treatment program for her, one with actual oversight, rather than the debt simply vanishing and everyone pretending the underlying problem didn't exist. My dad agreed, eventually, though not without some resistance at first. I think some part of him was embarrassed, honestly, having to formally negotiate terms with his own son from across the world, after having tried to just push the whole situation through without me. But he agreed. The sale closed properly about 6 weeks later, legitimate signatures this time, verified through actual notarization while I was still deployed, using proper channels the JAG office helped set up remotely. The house sold for around $340,000, my half coming to $170,000, minus what I'd committed toward Dana's treatment program and a negotiated portion toward her debt. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. Selling that house wasn't easy for me, even with everything that happened. That was my grandfather's house. Learning to ride a bike in that driveway, sitting on that porch listening to his stories. That all happened in a house that now belonged to somebody else entirely, some family I never met, living in rooms that used to hold my whole childhood. But I also understood by the end of all this that the house itself wasn't really the thing my grandfather had actually left me. What he'd left me was half ownership, real legal standing, in a decision that affected my own life and history, specifically so that decision couldn't just be made around me by someone else, whenever it was convenient for them. My dad took that standing away, briefly, through fraud, assuming distance and deployment meant I'd never find out, or never be able to do anything about it even if I did. Glenda's photo, one simple picture of a real estate sign, ended up being the thing that stopped that assumption from holding up. Dana went into treatment about 2 months after the sale closed, funded properly this time, actual medical oversight, actual follow-up care built into the program rather than just money thrown at a crisis to make it disappear quietly. I called her every week I could during my last 2 months of deployment, checking in, something I probably should have been doing more consistently even before any of this happened. She's about 8 months clean now, as of the last time we talked. Doing outpatient follow-up, working a steady job at a vet clinic, something she'd always wanted to do but never quite pursued before everything fell apart. I'm proud of her, honestly, in a way that feels different than just relief that a crisis got resolved. It feels like actual hope, for the first time in a long time. My relationship with my dad is still difficult, if I'm honest with you. We talk, occasionally, mostly logistics, mostly surface level. I came home from deployment about 4 months ago now, and I've seen him maybe 3 times since, each conversation a little easier than the last, but none of them quite reaching back to whatever comfortable normal we might have had before all this. I think the hardest part for me, actually, wasn't even the forgery itself, as serious as that was. It was understanding that his first instinct, faced with a real crisis involving his own daughter, was to solve it by taking something from his son without asking, assuming the son wouldn't find out, or wouldn't be able to do anything even if he did, sitting there in a war zone thousands of miles away. My mom and I are actually closer now than we were before, strangely enough. I think she felt caught in the middle of the whole situation the entire time, agreeing with my dad's urgency about Dana, while also, I think, feeling uncomfortable about how it was being handled, without ever quite finding the courage to say so directly until I forced the conversation into the open from Kandahar province. Glenda, the neighbor who sent that first photo, still lives 2 doors down from where our old house used to be. I called her, actually, once I got back stateside, just to thank her properly. She told me she almost didn't send that text, worried it wasn't her place to get involved in someone else's family business. "I'm really glad you did," I told her. "You have no idea what that photo actually stopped. I used the remainder of my share from the house sale, after Dana's treatment and the negotiated debt portion, to put a down payment on a small place of my own, outside San Antonio, close enough to visit family when I want to, far enough to have genuinely started building something that's entirely mine, not attached to anyone else's decisions or crises. Sometimes I think about that tent in Kandahar, staring at a photo of a for sale sign, feeling the ground shift under something I thought was solid and settled, half a world away from anything I could immediately control. I think about how easy it would have been for that sale to just close quietly, my forged signature buried in a filing cabinet somewhere, nobody ever questioning it, if Glenda hadn't happened to notice, hadn't happened to think it was worth sending me one simple photo, just to check. I don't know what would have happened if that text never came through. Maybe I'd have come home from deployment to a house that wasn't mine anymore, a signature I never gave, a decision made entirely without me while I was somewhere else fighting for a country that, ironically, has pretty clear laws about exactly this kind of fraud, laws that ended up protecting me the moment I actually knew enough to use them. But the text did come, and because of it, Dana got real help instead of just a quiet payoff. Because of it, I got to make my own decision about property my grandfather specifically wanted me to have a say in, rather than having that say quietly erased the moment it became inconvenient. That's really the whole story, when it comes down to it. Not some big dramatic reveal in a courtroom, just a neighbor's photo, a forged signature that didn't hold up to scrutiny, and a family that had to finally have an honest conversation about what protecting each other is actually supposed to look like, instead of what's just fastest and easiest in the moment. I think that's the most honest way I can put it.